There is something about growing up in California in the 1970s that stays with people forever. The endless summers, the freedom, the sense that the whole world was being invented right in their backyard. And if someone spent their childhood there, they know exactly what made it magical. This was a time when California kids lived outside. Skateboarding was being revolutionized in empty swimming pools. Beach culture shaped everything from fashion to language. Disneyland was the promised land, and the San Fernando Valley was filled with kids riding bikes until the streetlights came on. This was the decade of Star Wars mania. Big wheels on suburban sidewalks and summers that seemed to stretch forever. The hippie era had faded, but California was creating something new. Growing up in California meant growing up where American youth culture was being defined. Let's walk through what childhood and adolescence actually felt like during that golden decade. Some of this might bring back memories. Some of it might explain why California childhoods of that era remain so legendary. Let's step into that world. Growing up in California in the 1970s meant a childhood spent largely outdoors. The weather made it possible. While kids in other states were stuck inside during harsh winters, California children could play outside nearly every day of the year. Backyards were kingdoms. Pools were gathering places where neighborhood kids would show up uninvited and stay all afternoon. Parents did not hover. Children would leave in the morning on their bikes and not return until dinner. The only rule was to be home when the streetlights came on. The neighborhoods were new. Subdivisions had spread across Southern California throughout the 1960s, and by the 1970s, these developments were filled with young families. Tract homes lined streets with names like Meadowbrook and Sycamore Lane. Every block had dozens of children roughly the same age. Finding someone to play with was never a problem. The houses themselves had that distinctive California openness. Sliding glass doors led to patios and pools. The architecture assumed people would live partially outside. Bedrooms often had windows that stayed open year-round because there was no need for heating or cooling much of the time. Schools in California were well funded in the 1970s. Before Proposition 13 passed in 1978, property taxes supported schools generously. Classrooms had supplies. Sports programs were robust. Art and music were standard offerings. California schools felt optimistic. Open classroom designs were popular, with flexible spaces rather than rigid rows of desks. The educational philosophy emphasized creativity and self-expression. School lunches came on divided plastic trays, fish sticks on Fridays, rectangle pizza, cartons of milk. The cafeteria was loud and chaotic. Kids traded items from their lunches. An Oreo could get someone far. Skateboarding exploded in California during the 1970s. The urethane wheel, invented earlier in the decade, transformed what was possible on a board. Suddenly, skaters could ride faster and handle rough surfaces. The Z-Boys in Santa Monica pioneered an aggressive, surfing-influenced style that changed skateboarding forever. During the California drought of the mid-1970s, when pools stood empty across the state, skaters discovered that empty pools made perfect terrain. Backyard pools became skate parks. Kids would scout neighborhoods looking for drained pools, then return at night to skate. It was trespassing, but it was also the birth of modern skateboarding. Before we continue with the entertainment and culture that defined California childhood, if you are enjoying this look back at growing up in different times and places, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories about how American kids experienced the decades that shaped this country. Television shaped California childhoods just as it did everywhere else, but with a twist. Kids watched the same shows as children across America. Saturday morning cartoons were sacred. Scooby-Doo, the Flintstones, and Super Friends dominated. After school meant Gilligan's Island reruns and the Brady Bunch. But California kids also knew that much of what they watched was made just down the freeway. Hollywood was not abstract. It was where parents worked, where school field trips went, where someone's uncle knew someone who worked on a TV show. Star Wars arrived in 1977, and it changed everything. California kids lined up around the block at theaters, and the film played continuously for months. Action figures became essential, and children spent their allowances on Kenner Star Wars figures, collecting characters and staging elaborate backyard battles. The movie felt like it belonged to California, in part because it was made by George Lucas up in Marin County with special effects created in Van Nuys. Disneyland remained the ultimate California childhood destination. Space Mountain opened in 1977, bringing science fiction thrills to Tomorrowland. Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion were already classics. A trip to Disneyland was an event planned weeks in advance. Families would arrive when the gates opened and stay until the park closed. The memory of walking down Main Street towards Sleeping Beauty Castle in the evening, exhausted and happy, stayed with California kids forever. The beach was where California teenagers gathered. Each coastal community had its own character. Huntington Beach was for serious surfers. Venice was eccentric and slightly dangerous. Malibu was exclusive. Santa Monica had the pier. Teenagers would pile into cars and head to the beach on weekends. They smelled copper-toned sunscreen, heard transistor radios playing California rock, and kept the ritual of watching the sunset. Beach culture influenced everything about how California teenagers dressed, talked, and thought about themselves. Music surrounded California youth. The car radio played the Eagles, Fleetwood Mac, and the Doobie Brothers. These were California bands making California sounds. Concerts at the Forum in Inglewood or the Greek Theater were teenage milestones. Record stores like Tower Records, which started in Sacramento, were gathering places where teenagers discovered music. Teenagers spent hours buying an album, studying the cover art, and reading the liner notes while listening on headphones. Fast food was central to California teenage life. In-N-Out Burger was the local favorite, but there was also Del Taco, Taco Bell, and countless regional chains. Teenagers would cruise to these places, hang out in parking lots, see and be seen. The car culture that defined California meant that as soon as someone turned 16, freedom arrived. Driving up Pacific Coast Highway with friends, windows down, music playing. Growing up in California in the 1970s was not without challenges. The oil crisis made gas expensive, and lines at the pump were long. Smog hung over Los Angeles on many days, and children were sometimes kept inside during smog alerts. By the late 1970s, housing costs were rising rapidly as California became more desirable. What defined growing up in California in the 1970s was the sense of possibility and freedom. Children roamed neighborhoods without supervision. Teenagers had the beach, the car, and endless summer. The culture being created in California spread across America, but California kids experienced it first. For those who spent their childhood in the Golden State during that decade, the memories remain vivid. The sunshine, the freedom, the sense that California was where the future was happening. For those with memories of this remarkable era, there is always more history to explore.